back. Yay. Um, wow. It's a great privilege for us to have you all here to pay tribute to our dear friend and colleague, Professor Phil Baines. I'm Ratna. I'm the head of college at St. Martin's, and it's my privilege to welcome you here today. We're very proud of our Professor of Typography. And it's a really important point for us as looking at all of the pictures, as you must have, reflecting back on who Phil was for us. So as we pay tribute today with family, friends, and colleagues, I have a little bit of an ask. Phil has made such a gigantic contribution in terms of education and in terms of typographic practice that lives within each one of us and has impacted each of us so tremendously. So my ask is really that as you leave today, you think about how you can practice Phil, the best of who Phil was to you, inside of you, so that we take Phil out into the world with us as he gave to us. So I'm going to hand over now to our chaplain, Mark Dean, for the next words. Thank you very much, and you're very welcome.
Hi, so my name's Mark Dean. I'm a university chaplain, and St. Martin's is one of the colleges that I'm privileged to cover. And it's a privilege to be invited to say a few words tonight at this gathering for Phil's friends and colleagues who are gathered here. So I'm here in my role as a university chaplain and thus as a colleague of Phil's, but I hope that I can say that we were also friends. We first connected when Phil actually reviewed my artwork in an exhibition that also included Dom Sylvester Huidar, Aliki Brain and Anna Sikorska. Phil's review began autobiographically saying, "I first came across the work of the Dominican monk, concrete poet and scholar Dom Sylvester Huidar in the compendium Art Without Boundaries, 1950 to 1970, which was published by Thames and Hudson in 1972. The book in general and the concrete poetry of Huidar in particular formed an alternative set of references for several of us studying graphics at art school in the early 1980s. That was the beginning of Phil's review. And when revisiting this review while I was preparing these words, I came across a description of the book that so inspired Phil as a young student, written by Adrian Shaughnessy, who coincidentally also wrote Phil's obituary for The Guardian and perhaps is here today. I don't know. No, okay. Anyway, back in 2003, Adrian wrote these words about the book Art Without Boundaries for I magazine. Quote, "Though it features work from the 1950s and early 1960s, its tone and message is quintessentially of its time. The jacket blurb announces the book's central theme. The most exciting and possibly the most fruitful trend in the visual arts since the early 1950s has been the steady erosion of traditional boundaries between painting and sculpture, painting and film, film and typography, photography and printmaking, fine and commercial art. In the book's short introduction, the theme is expanded upon. At one time, it was easy to distinguish between the fine artist and the commercial artist, the editors note. It is now less easy. The qualities which differentiated the one from the other are now often common to both. The painter who once saw the commercial designer as a toady to the financial pressures of industry may now find that the dealer can impose a tyranny worse than that of any client. During the last 20 years or so, barriers have been broken down, and they are still being broken down." That was written in 1972 and inspired Phil, but Adrian's essay goes on to question whether this optimism has been vindicated in the intervening years. He thinks not. Nonetheless, we know that it informed Phil's work, both as an artist and as a teacher, and in this regard, at least, was not in vain. Phil not only practiced these principles of crossing boundaries in his work, he did so in his life. Although he famously gave up his vocation to the priesthood to study art and design, he did not give up his faith, even though it was not culturally compatible with his new career. I know that this tension is not easy to maintain because I've walked a similar path, although starting from the other end, so to speak, beginning at art school and later becoming a priest. And perhaps that is the way that we became friends. After Phil began to include me in the group of priest friends for whom he made a Paschal candle, Easter candle design each year. I remember the first time he did so, when he excitedly invited me into the letterpress room here at CSM to show me his work while it was still drying. I know it was a great frustration to Phil that first COVID and then his illness prevented him from continuing with this letterpress work. I also had the privilege of seeing Phil's Paschal candle designs around his coffin in the church at his funeral, lighting his way as he was commended to God. And now that we are gathered here together at a memorial event for those friends and colleagues who were not able to be at the funeral, my hope is that the light that surrounded Phil throughout his life will not only continue to guide him, but also those of us who are left behind and who will one day follow him on that journey, crossing the boundary between this world and whatever is to come. However we might understand that, let us continue to take inspiration from the way that Phil lived and worked, crossing boundaries and maintaining relationships in the process. Thank you.
Philip Andrew was born to Martin and Joan Baines on the 8th of December 1958 in Kendal, then Westmoreland. 2 years later, a little sister appeared, Margaret. And then 3 years after that, a little brother, Christopher. Phil went to primary school at St Cuthbert's School in Windermere, and then aged 11 went off to junior seminary. After A-levels, he studied for the Roman Catholic priesthood at Ushaw College, Durham, before switching to graphic design. From 1981 to 82, he studied for his foundation in art and design at Carlisle College of Art. And in 1982, he started his BA in graphic design at St Martin's School of Art, which is where he met Jackie Warner. They both left St Martin's for the RCA and graduated in 1987. They were married on the 11th of February 1989 and would go on to have 2 lovely daughters, Beth and Felicity. Phil started teaching at CSM in 1988 as an associate lecturer and was made a 0.5 lecturer in typography in 1991, followed by his appointment as a professor in 2006. He retired earlier than planned in 2020 as his ataxia symptoms worsened, though still did all he could to raise awareness and funding for this little-known neurological disorder. In November 2023, CSM held the exhibition Next Doll, Phil Baines Celebrating Letters. But just weeks later came the sad news that Phil's condition was worsening and that he had been re-diagnosed as having multiple system atrophy. He was at home with Jackie when he died on the 19th of January 2024, in the evening of what had been a lovely and peaceful day. And he is much missed by many, not least his family, who are here today. This evening's tributes begin with the voices of fellow practitioners in recognition of Phil's interdisciplinary contribution to design. Please welcome Professor Neville Brodie, Dean of the School of Communication and Head of the Visual Communication Programme at the Royal College of Art.
Thank you, Catherine. That must have been quite difficult. I feel kind of very humbled up here. It's incredible to celebrate such an incredible man who made such an incredible contribution to why we're all here. I've written some stuff down, and I may waver in this, so we'll see. Partly because I'm not wearing the right glasses. See, things I remember about Phil Baines, turning up for a serious meeting in my studio with serious people, wearing his full cycling gear. Turning up to what was a major planning session saying, actually, I've got to leave in a minute. I've booked myself a 2-week driving course, right? And I'll come back when I passed. And he was spiky, you know, we know that. He was a lovely man, but so spiky and so contradictory and contrary. I just was doing a lot of research for this, and I came across a review of my second book in 1994, where he trashed it. It was barely a kind word. I mean, he said he respected my work, but the book was terrible. So thanks, Phil. But seriously, Phil Baines was an incredibly thoughtful, insightful typographer, graphic designer, and dedicated educator and writer. His impact on the way we see the world has helped fundamentally shape, reform, and inform our modern visual language. Humble, I put humble here, but that wasn't ever true, was it? Hugely influential practitioner that the UK has on rare occasions managed to foster, and we owe him a huge debt of gratitude. On viewing his recent exhibition here at CSM, I was reminded yet again of just how much we owe him. And at least I had the honour of being able to tell him that. The extent to which his work has had a profound effect and influence on the way we now approach and think about graphic design and typography is huge. And it's kind of invisible, but it's there. It's part of our daily practice. He drew strong influence from classic holy manuscripts to which he was exposed during his earlier, more ascetic life when studying to become a priest. And he was able to link the creativity that he found in that practice and the manuscripts and link it to our modern age and modern technology. And in doing so, help define what we can now recognizably term British typography. His rich body of experimental work from the late 80s shows an astonishing energy and courage, and he was trailblazing new ways to consider the printed word and the organization of it on the page. He changed the way we guide the eye around, and he introduced sophisticated playfulness and intellectual joy. He was a committed letterpress typographer. I remember Richard Dowse talking about turning up at the RCA with his white kit on, covered in printing ink, no matter what day of the week or what time. And he introduced a kind of intellectual joy, as I said, and he employed all of this to stunning effect when moving over to the computer and working in digital. In fact, one of the criticisms he made of my book in 1994 was that the computer was just a tool and would never become a medium, and then went on to master it as a medium. He was driven by a deep commitment to the importance of craft. He was painstakingly detailed in what he did, and he would never shy from passionately expressing his point of view, as we know. We often had disagreements, but throughout everything we had a deep respect. I first encountered Phil when he was a student at the Royal College of Art. I gave a lecture and a workshop to a bunch of renegades at the time, including Andy, who's going to speak a bit later, and Jonathan Barnbrook and GTF, and I was struck even then by the level of bravery and conviction and innovation he brought and how he inspired those around him. In fact, I think he studied and started practicing as a designer at a highly challenging political juncture in British society. If we think back to that time, this was Thatcher's Britain, and it was deep into the embracing of superficiality and consumerism. And the radical spirit of punk had been replaced at this point by things like new romanticism, a surface affectation and shallow materiality. But Phil's work represented a counterpoint, a vital counterpoint to all of this. It was steeped in ecclesiastic tradition and letterpress sensibility. It embraced difficulty as well as playfulness. It brought a different joy to typographic design and how we engaged with the written word, almost poetic in the way he would compose his pages. For Phil, working with letterpress took on an almost performative nature. He said in an interview in iMagazine that he felt uncomfortable dealing with space on the page and would always fill every corner of that. But in doing so, he created inner tension, inner playfulness, and he drew the eye in. We worked together on a lot of occasions, every collaboration of which was incredibly valuable, and I learned a lot from it. We worked closely with Phil on Fuse magazine, the experimental laboratory for experimental typography. And the very first issue, we selected him to contribute one of the typefaces and posters. And in doing that, he actually started one of the key explorations of Fuse, which is how much of a letter form do we need in order to read words. So he created two fonts, both of them completely different. One explored this idea of perception through how much of a letter form do we need, and the other, which was called Ashur, after his school, where he studied to become a priest, was incredibly flamboyant and informed by an excess of austere flourishes. Provocative as always, with, as I put here, his trademark naughty grin. He was always grinning mischievously and caused mischief, as we all know. And he was, at the time, interested in other stuff that was always breaking the pattern. And we asked him to edit issue number 4 of Fuse. And he introduced the UK to what at the time was this anarchistic approach to typography that was coming out of Cranbrook and American institutions, and introduced it to us, and we hated it. And then now we love it. And then now we hate it again. As a design educator, Phil's dedication and commitment has always been immense. He always cares deeply about the individual and their creative insights. His mentoring skills are unparalleled. And his highly supportive leadership style has equally affected staff who work alongside him, as well as the students that studied under him. As a prolific writer, there's people here from iMagazine. He also wrote a number of books. He never shied away from expressing an opinion or wry provocation. He would always be open to debate, however, even though he would sulk off sometimes, but that's another story. He was passionate, first and foremost. He was caring, intelligent, warm-hearted, and incredibly generous. And I think we can add the name Phil Baines to a long and extensive list of great British typographers, a list that includes John Baskerville, Jonathan Barnbrook, Margaret Calvert, hi Margaret, Matthew Carter, William Caslon, William Caxton, Stanley Morrison, and William Morris. Thank you for the honour of remembering Phil. Thank you.
As many people will know, Phil made the jump in recent years from the page to the park. And here to talk about some of the architectural collaborations that Phil made with is architect Kevin Carmody from Carmody Group. Thank you very much for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you very much for asking me to come and say a few words today. I have to say, in the context of many of you in the room, our relationship and our friendship with Phil is probably relatively recent. Many of you go back in time in friendship with Phil well beyond maybe our experience, but we thought it would be interesting to maybe talk a little bit about his relationship with architecture in the city. I've written this down to make sure that I keep to time, so please bear with me reading. We were introduced to Phil in 2008 by Lewis Kinnear, who's sitting at the back of the studio. He worked in our studio at the time, and I guess the introduction was made off the back of us winning a commission to design the London memorial for the 7 July bombings. We'd seen Phil and Catherine's wonderful book called Signs and Lettering in the Environment, and those who haven't seen that book, I think it's something maybe to circle back to. This project for the memorial became the beginning of a conversation about architecture, about place and about purpose. A series of collaborations sprang out of that first conversation, and ultimately a friendship through many years and many projects. I think for us, the common ground in our collaboration between designers, between an architect and someone very interested in the signs, the signals, the communication within cities, is based in a shared interest in the making of physical things. Using projects as a type of conversation between designers, we developed a clear understanding of the ideas, the material techniques in each project, specific in their place and where they have originated from, and how they were appropriated into our cities. We often discussed the cultural understanding of a place and its purpose. I don't think these two things can be separated. And we find clarity in this approach together through those conversations. And it was sort of an understanding of the process of how something is made to arrive at its material, to arrive at what something looks like. And I think there's a real cultural value in that Phil understood. And I think that breadth of knowledge across his many interests brought those things together. We think that this approach was generated out of Phil's uncompromising desire to be inquisitive, to understand the visual representation of a physical world around us, but ultimately its meaning to everyone. This is an understanding, looking back at some of those wonderful books, built up over many years with Catherine and the many students who researched with him, where the designed and the found, the undesigned worlds meet, observed and documented by Phil and his wonderful team. These observations for us informed an approach spanning high and subcultures simultaneously, with many layers of history to inform the deep genealogical understanding of design over time, a word we often discussed. I think to understand what I mean by that, I think it's maybe helpful to give some anecdotes. Phil would know that there is a Roman entablature sitting in St. Paul's that genealogically links Eric Gill's humanist transport lettering to a 2,000-year-old sans serif Roman memorial inscription. It's a good starting point for a project. Or that the process of sandcasting lettering in stainless steel could bring such unique character, figure, and meaning. One where the message and the architecture are simultaneously fused in an instant. Or that O's, P's, and B's have a generous human quantity in our cities, as they allow birds and squirrels to drink from the letters, which he always wanted. Phil was a rare and inquisitive intellect and a wonderful person to know and collaborate with. I learned so much from each and every conversation with him, but it was never what I expected. Thank you.
Over the years, a huge part of Phil's practice was collaborative work with fine artists on books and publications and exhibitions. And a huge part of that was his work with Matt's Gallery, which lasted 27 years? 29 years, I'm miscounting, 29 years, nearly 30 years, working with Matt's Gallery. And we're really lucky to have Tim Dixon here this evening to talk a little bit about Phil's time working with Matt's Gallery. Thank you, Tim.
Right, thank you. So I'm going to read some words and reflections made by Matt's Gallery Director, Robin Klasnick. So these words he put into order with me, and I'm the Deputy Director at Matt's. You can see Robin and Phil together on the picture there. So as many of you may already be aware, Phil and Robin enjoyed a very special collaboration that continued over almost 30 years. Working at the gallery over the last 7 years, I got to witness this, and I also got to know Phil. And I really enjoyed the warm, good-natured, good-humoured and very hands-on way that Robin and Phil worked together. Together they made flyers, posters, signage, bags, business cards and books for the gallery. And these included an ongoing series of small publications known as white books, which I'll say more about shortly. Phil's final piece of design work was a white book for the artist Carolyn Thompson. We actually have some copies here tonight, which you're very welcome to take, so please have a look. Alongside, there's some previous examples of Phil's work with the gallery, which you're welcome to take with you this evening. Carolyn's book was particularly special because the text of the white book was made up of excerpts taken from 40 white books that preceded it. And the text also became a video, which you can view on our website in the Matflix section. So now I'm going to read Robin's tribute to Phil Baines. It came as a shock to learn that Phil Baines had passed away on the 19th of January 2024. Just a couple of months before, in November, I was with him here at the Leatherby Gallery at Central St Martin's, celebrating the opening of his exhibition, Extol. The exhibition showed the breadth of his work, mapping out his development as a typographic designer over the decades. A highlight was glimpsing pages from his student sketchbooks in glass vitrines. They reminded me of Ian Breakwell's diaries and seemed to foreshadow Same Old Story, a book that we made with Willie Doherty in 1997. I was touched and delighted to see a section dedicated to Phil's work with Matt's Gallery. The exhibition talked a lot about his different clients. I'm not really sure I know what the word client means. Phil and I just got on. I first met him in 1995 through the artist Ian McKeever. We wanted to make a book for his exhibition, the Marion North paintings, and Ian's wife, Galinda Gabriel, suggested that we talk to Phil, who had been doing some design work for her at the Goethe Institute in London. When I saw his business card, I admit that I was sceptical. I thought this guy couldn't design his way out of a paper bag. He had a studio he'd built for himself in his garden. It looked something like a railway signalman's hut. The garden was filled with signs, something of a passion of his, I would learn later. He and his wife Jackie looked after the garden together. I suspect that it was probably Jackie who had the green fingers. Phil's hut was no bigger than a black taxi cab, with bikes, another passion of his, hanging inside, alongside piles and piles of paper, 35mm slides and paraphernalia. It was standing room only with one seat. I could never find anything. But Phil seemed to know where everything was. We got talking about Ian's book. Ian is an artist who does a lot of walking, drawing, painting, writing, and takes photographs. Phil said to me, I know nothing about photographs. I'm good at typography, but I don't know anything about photographs. We told him not to worry, and we got to work, probably after he'd got himself a cup of tea and a bicky, as he usually did. At the gallery, we laid out all these 10x8 photographs, black and white, hand-printed by the artist, on the floor, and that was how it started. It was a marriage made in heaven. He was unassuming and open to anything. From there, we just collaborated, and it went on until he stopped working last year. The last book we did together was a small white book for Carolyn Thompson's Vague Poetics. The white books were a series of free publications accompanying our exhibitions. They were started in the 1980s and usually, but not always, printed in black and white. The first one Phil did was in 2001 with the artist Juan Cruz. He went on to do 29 with us, Carolyn's being the last. Vague Poetics is an archive of all 40 white books that preceded it, and it felt like an appropriate work to act as a full stop for an almost 30-year-long collaboration. Almost by default, Phil ended up branding Matt's gallery. We used typefaces he had designed. He made our books, our flyers, posters, signage, tote bags, business cards, and he even designed our first website. It was very text orientated, with large type, almost like a children's book. In many ways, it was a great website, but having been designed like printed pages with contents, indexes, and columns of text, it was almost non-navigable. I loved it. I loved to get lost in it. Each show at Matt's gallery is a collaboration with an artist, and it was exactly the same with Phil. He would come in himself, usually in his cyclist lycra, to fit vinyl, hang signs, and paint lettering. He was hands-on, as you can see in the picture. And the place you see in the picture, this was a Victorian shop front on Webster Road, Bermondsey. He would cycle down with his stencils and paints in his bag, ready to add artist names to the burgundy facade, which is what's happening here. I would then strike through them when the show was over. Phil worked closely with artists too. He would often credit things as having been designed by him and the artist. Some of the books he designed are just exceptional. He's done such a lot. I think his favourite of the books we did together might have been Anne Bean's autoobituary, Shadow Deeds, in 2006, a book within a book. Phil wasn't flashy in his designs, but he knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it really, really well. He knew so much about typography, its history, and its applications. On one occasion, when I was in his studio, I was querying something in the text about religion, and I said, "Shouldn't we look this up? How do we know it's correct?" I was a bit surprised when he said, "Don't worry, I know all about religion. I trained for the priesthood." I was gobsmacked. One day he had woken up and said, "I think I'll go to Central St. Martin's." It was a whole different side of him that I didn't know. We would often work together in the evenings after his day of teaching had finished. He would be in his signalman's hut and I would be in my kitchen at home. We would discuss what needed to be done over Skype. At night in his hut, he would fit these wooden shutters he had made over the windows to shut out the dark, and in the morning he would take them out again. I didn't realise for a while what a legend he really was. He was a brilliant designer. He spent a lot of his life teaching typography at St. Martin's. In some ways, maybe his work was an outlet for him not to be a teacher, but still, I always felt like I was his student. I often asked him if I could have an MA or an MFA yet. Had I passed the course? I only actually saw him lecture once. It may have been when his book Penguin by Design came out in 2005, or it may have been in 2006 when he became a professor. He did it like a top of the pops rundown of his favourite Penguin book covers. He was superb, eccentric, a bit naughty, and unassuming as ever. If my memory serves me right, his #1 was the first paperback edition of James Joyce's Ulysses, printed in 1969, designed by Hans Schmoller. It's a simple cover, purely typographical, with white text against a black background. It was very Phil Baines, clear, bold, and practical, with more than a touch of class and elegance. Phil Baines knew the ins and outs and the mechanisms of types, signs, and typography. He was a part of the gallery and is sorely missed by me, the gallery staff, the artists, and everyone else. What a star.
So we're going to move now from thinking about tributes from practitioners and fellow practitioners to thinking about education. And we're going to begin with Phil as a student, and here to share some reminiscences of their times as a student together are Andrew Altman and Mr. Mike Nicholson.
Can you hear me, Mother? So, thinking back, Phil and I were very different, but we shared a few things. We were both from the Lake District. We attended a foundation course from 81 to 82 in the grim northern city of Carlisle and shared the same gang of varied creative people. We applied for the St. Martin's School of Art Graphic Design BA starting September 82. One quick thing about that, when the three of us announced that our plans were to apply to St. Martin's, the foundation tutors, once they knew about this, they brought us into the office. This is my memory of it, and essentially said, we applaud your ambition, but St Martin's is never going to take what would be roughly 10% of their applicants this year from a small regional foundation course like this. So we all applied and we all got in. But I think Phil had, he'd really done his homework, and he understood the risk far more than I did, certainly. Strange one. We benefited, the point being, we benefited from free 5-day-a-week tuition and studio work, fantastic studio tutors and professional visitors from a variety of areas. We had excellent facilities and technicians, and it was a golden age. And you know who you are out there. There are quite a lot of us from that year here tonight. Stranger, we lived on the same floor at Halls once we came to London, Hall of Residence, and most surprising of all, probably to both of us, we ended up sharing a flat for several years. I think Phil evolved throughout those few years. No hair on that one, but the bright dyed hair was the least of it. But he was only evolving towards what he was all along, really. He maintained an admirable consistency. His intricate notebooks were actually already a part of his method, in my recollection, back in Carlisle. So he already had stuff like that going as a kind of muscle memory thing already when he came to London. He felt more fully formed and dedicated in himself. He was seeking identified goals, and he didn't make any big statements about it that I recall, but he seemed to know what he wanted. If he thought me disorderly and undisciplined by comparison, he was right. I think most people were. He seemed hungry. He was burning quietly bright. He was so focused, and he pushed and tested and took risks. He was perfectly able to be daft as a brush, but recently the things I've remembered more are the times, whether it be when we shared a flat or sometimes in studio, but his voice would quieten, his face became serious, and he would discuss some current issue with great insight and thoughtfulness, whether it was a world event or a personal problem. He gave it his attention. He knew how to help himself more than most of us, but I think he liked to help others a lot. But I really still, I talked with Andy about this today, I still don't think I knew him that well, but what a privilege to know him at all.
Hi. It's weird stood here, looking out there, all of you. I shared a stage with Phil quite a few times over the years. He would always have a set of meticulously prepared notes and read from them word for word. I, however, would always wing it and make things up as I went along. But tonight I'm going with Phil's methods, as I'm not sure I could get through it otherwise. So here we go. There is an often quoted saying, those who can do, those who can't teach. This did not apply to Phil Baines. He was both a supremely talented designer and typographer, as anyone who saw his long overdue retrospective here before Christmas can testify to. But he was also an awe-inspiring teacher who touched hundreds of lives, leaving an incomparable legacy. I first met Phil in the corridor of Ralph West Halls of Residence in 1982. Our rooms were opposite each other. We were both about to embark on the graphic design degree course at St Martin's School of Art. He had a head of spiky dyed red hair, an earring, the obligatory 1980s Oxfam suit, and pixie boots. Exactly the kind of figure my mother worried about me mixing with at art school. It was only his sensible glasses that gave a clue to a possible more serious side to his character. On the first day of term, we were allocated desks alphabetically, so again we were next to each other, and from there on our friendship grew. I soon discovered Phil was a few years older than most of us, and it was a huge surprise to learn that he had previously spent 3 years studying to become a priest before attending art school. This experience was obviously a major influence in his development of his character and his attitude to life and work. It also seeped into his college projects from the very beginning. The priest in Phil was always there in some form. He was incredibly disciplined about everything he did. He was the only student to really embrace the letterpress facilities and taught himself to set type traditionally and then push the boundaries, creating his own unique typographic voice. His monthly letterpress postcards were always something I looked forward to receiving, as Phil did not hold prisoners with some of his thoughts on his fellow students and the staff. In the final year at St. Martin's and through our time at the RCA, we shared a flat together with this man alongside me. It was not unlike being in a series of the young ones. Every weekday, Phil would work on his college projects from 10 till 6, then don his white overall, ascend to the letterpress room for 2 hours, cycle home, eat huge quantities of potatoes and sausages, religiously listen to his hero John Peel on the radio, sat in his bath chair that he'd found in the street, while working on his sketchbooks at his large upright drawing board before finally hitting the sack. Everything was ordered and monastic-like, a repeatable routine to achieve the goals he set himself. He even removed the single bed from his tiny room and slept on a camping mat that he kept between the legs of his drawing board. Sackcloth and ashes, perhaps. However, Phil was also a rebel, a man with a punk attitude. In combination with professional knowledge, priestly wisdom, and a wicked, wry sense of humour. It was quite a concoction. He was a true one-off. From the very beginning, Phil was far more knowledgeable about design and typography than his fellow students. It was like having an extra tutor on tap, who was always happy to share his knowledge and encourage others around him. One day at college, he handed me a copy of Herbert Spencer's Pioneers of Modern Typography, saying, "You might like this." It was a life-changing moment for me. Until that point, I'd considered typography to be a dull occupation for men in tweed jackets with beards. I will always be grateful to him for the inspiration and the self-belief he gave me. On leaving the RCA, myself and 2 fellow students, David and Howard, formed by complete accident the graphic design company Why Not Associates. If that had not happened, I often wonder if Phil and I would have collaborated more and where that would have led to. Phil, however, was a regular visitor into Why Not in Soho, and we continued to collaborate on projects. As his teaching career developed, many of his students came to do placement with us at Why Not, including his and Jackie's lovely daughter, Beth. We always knew if Phil recommended someone that we would not be disappointed in their ability or their attitude, with several of them becoming full-time employees. He inspired and encouraged a generation of talent through his teaching and passion, and it was no surprise observing him becoming such a revered professor and much-loved teacher. Like typography, it was in his blood. He was born to kern and to teach. I miss that wicked smile and that knowing look. Rest in peace.
So next we have somebody that both taught Phil, but also gave him his first teaching job. And it's a great pleasure. Also taught me, and actually probably quite a lot of us here in this room. I was going to say we could do a hands up of all the people in this room who were taught by Jeff. But please welcome Jeff Val.
Hello, everybody. This story starts 40 years ago to this very month, March 1984. Phil was in his second year I met him on my return from a sabbatical overseas. The course was asked to design a portable exhibition. The subject was leprosy. Like its physical condition, none of the course wanted to handle it. So it came to me and to the second years on, oh my Lord, they proved to be one of the most exceptional set of students ever. They could not call on fashionable current Western graphics for this job. So they, as fundamental designers, drew from the artifacts and detritus found all over the developing world. Old tires, plastic pipe, crude fixings, unpolished text, and imagery would express strong messages. Text setting was to be by means of a keyboarded rotary pen producing dim letter forms. Phil was an enthusiastic participant here, realizing that the exhibition had to be no soft, ordinary event. The result was raw, appropriate, effective. 1 year on, spring 1985. It is now degree show poster designing time in the third year studio. Here, Phil was working with red, blue and black biros, moving letters within the constraint of a poster format, disregarding traditional line and word breaks, using hyphens and playing with numerals. Time came to present to them upstairs. Surely they wouldn't like it. Too graphic, too unreadable. Surprise, they loved it. Well done, Phil. 2 years on, June 1987. I was now the course director. Phil was finishing at the RCA. I needed his quirky originality for design, letterform and typography, and I was determined to get him for the course. He accepted my invitation. So it was. Day one, first hour. He commandeered the broom cupboard over there. He labelled it Typography. No, he didn't. Typography department. Instantly, the course grew in stature. Although some excellent previous students had specialised in typography, now a wider group were attracted to it. Soon, the central lettering record would come under Phil's directorship, to be joined by Dr. Catherine Dixon. Well appreciated there, who now continues that spirit with commitment and passion. This is the last page. Here we go. Phil, always a designer, fair-minded, fearlessly direct, academically sound, yet radically challenging, interestingly, a very dear friend of mine. Sorry, not interesting, increasingly. It's these spectacles, you know. Imagine an early summer's evening, probably 1997. Phil and I spent the day together assessing a degree work. both quite tired, alone in the silent company of the folders of work, 2 small glasses produced. Glasses filled with single malt whisky. Quiet chat, highs and lows of the day discussed. Some wit, great respect, cherished memory. When you think of all the students of this course who have made their mark very decisively in the world of visual communication, we know where Phil stands within these ranks. A hugely significant designer, typographer and academic. He joins that squadron of other powerful designers who have together established and endorsed the standing of this great college. Thank you.
We've heard a lot about Phil and letterpress, and Helen's here to share a little bit about Phil's contribution to the ongoing stature of letterpress here at CSM. Welcome, Helen Ingham.
Thank you. Oh, house, that's great. I first met Phil in 2006 at Southampton Row in the old Central building. I was called in to cover for the letterpress technician who was on long-term sick leave, which I periodically continued to do until he retired in 2013. I was immediately struck by the place in general and the warmth of the graphic design team, and of which Phil was an integral part. You know, it's almost like the family you don't know you have. As well as a love of type and letters and a passion for the letterpress process, we found we've got much more in common, and many of our eccentricities and obsessions resonated. And it was refreshing not to try and have to explain these things as you would with your normal blood relatives. Anyway, during my first period there, I was able to get Phil's favourite FAG 405 proof press running again, and up and running, which he was very pleased about, because this enabled him to start using the workshop for various projects that he was involved with, including later on the Pascal candles, of course. When the move to this site started to be planned, the future of the letterpress workshops looks very bleak, as you may know if you've been involved with moves in these places. Real estate is everything, and rooms full of what some may see as obsolete old equipment taking up space aren't sort of top of the list. So Phil, however, possibly given his own experience as a student and later on in his practice, understood the wider value of letterpress as a multifaceted teaching resource, and in our case, a unique one. A couple of years later, this was borne out because a couple of years ago, this was borne out because UAL held an event in our letterpress workshop, and it was, I think it was a governor's event or something like that, and there was guests involved. And one of the architects who attended this event had been to a meeting with Phil, and he said how pleased he was that the letterpress had survived, because he told me of Phil's impassioned, reasoned argument stating that the DNA of this college lies within this room, which, if you think about it, it's true, given the William Letherby's teaching ideas and the ideas within the Central School that craft processes and academic research have equal footing. And as a side note, I'll also say this was true of Phil's teaching as well. Leading up to the move, I was employed elsewhere. I wasn't actually here, but I know how hard Phil worked to move the workshop. He worked like a Trojan. It was incredible, the amount of work he had to do. We kept in touch, and he planned all the moving of the equipment and the positioning of it all in the workshop. And, you know, it's again, it's because of him and his contribution. That's why we've got what we have. Anyway, eventually I took up the permanent post as specialist technician, and often with Phil's support, you know, I've been able to transform the workshop as it was into what I'd hope is a vibrant, welcoming space to enable the practical exploration of type and lettering, and to support the academics in their study and in the typographic section of the graphic design course, I suppose. Over the years, Phil's students from undergrad to PhD have used the workshop for research and development, and you know, and it's been a pleasure to welcome them in and just help them in whatever way I can, and show them the treasures within the workshop, many of which you know, have been recent discoveries, because you know, it's been anyway, I've got a bit lost. I'll carry on. Phil was a sounding board for my wild ideas, and he was pragmatic yet visionary as well. You know, he was open to ideas, but there was all this inherent practicality there. And he was also a huge support when seemingly illogical decisions made elsewhere in the college would have impacted on the workshop. My husband, Rick, who also works here as the metalwork technician, he also got to know Phil. And quite often Phil would go into metalwork and he'd say, Rick, can you make us some brackets for this sign? Or he'd take a manhole cover in there and say, Rick, can you shine this up? And 4 hours later, my husband would emerge from the welding booth covered in crap and rust, and with a shiny manhole cover, take it up to Phil in graphics, and Phil would go, oh, thanks, Rick, leave it over there. And that'd be it. But anyway, we'd also, the three of us, share a love of steam trains, because of where we lived after Phil moved out of London. We'd plot routes of the Flying Scotsman, for example, send each other films, and spot the train as it went down the London North Eastern route. In the early days of Southampton Row, this is, I've got a few memories now. I've been working fairly late, and as I was leaving, I saw Phil in Lycra, as usual, clip-clopping down the stairs, and he had a more flash-looking bicycle than his normal ride, and he said, I'm off to Brighton. He said, I've got a big bunch of bananas and 2 saurine malt loaves, that should do me. And I also remember his disdain when I'd been involved in a letterpress project for Ditchling Museum, and I'd used Garamond. I had very good reasons for doing that, but Phil didn't think it was. Phil couldn't think of one. And he was, like I say, he used to use the letterpress workshop for his own work. And on one occasion, when he was printing the Pascal candles, unfortunately, some builders had been in, and they had left. They'd been doing some work, and unfortunately, they'd left some swarf in the cleaning rags box, and Phil had cleaned the type up, and he was devastated. Can you hear me at the back? Got an echo in here. Right. Shall I continue? Yeah, he was devastated. He'd scratched the type, and he was. I could tell he was quite worried about telling me. I think he thought I was going to tell him off, but you know, I had to sort of pacify him a bit, and I said, "Look, no, it's the builder's fault. We'll blame them." But anyway, like I say, he was quite worried about this. But yeah, we blamed the contractors. Anyway, the times in the workshop when he came in to work on his Pascal candles and Christmas cards as well with Catherine. And it was always a joy to have Catherine in the workshop as well, because she'd rein him in. He was a great typesetter, useless at cleaning though, quite disorganized. You couldn't, you know, there's still type standing there now, which I'm discovering that was his. And there's also dried ink on letters as well, which I'm still discovering, you know, because he was never any good at cleaning up. And he was really pleased when I found the lost 72-point Perpetua, particularly the U, because it's got that nice sort of fender. He supported me during my Roman Romans typography exhibition and series of events that I put on at the college, with one of his famous walking tours and one of his lectures as well. And also the typography pub quizzes, the Christmas lecture with him in his Santa suit handing out sort of prizes. I said he was so excited when he took up bell ringing, and again this one of the charts they use formed one of the Pascal Candle designs. The college is quieter without his enthusiasm, and it's I wouldn't say less of a rich place, but this in some ways it's diminished. The good-natured hoots coming over the balcony, the insults, it was so much part of the fibre of this place. And of course I'm sad, I mean, especially working up in letterpress, because he was such a big part of that place. But I hope Phil's legacy and joyful spirit will live on in the letterpress workshop. He saved it, and during my time here I'll do my best to uphold that. Most of all, I'm sure that Ricky and as well as me, we remember our friend with gratitude, joy and love, because in the end that's the best we can leave behind. That said, Phil is the second person I know that's had ataxia and multiple system atrophy. And at the moment, Ataxia UK have an exhibition of artworks, some by ataxia sufferers, and I've done an edition of prints inspired by Phil's Pascal Candle designs. So there's an edition of prints that will be for sale on their site for this exhibition, which is online until the end of March. So there's an edition of 20 prints. If you want to look at the website, it's ataxia.org.uk through my gaze. That's the exhibition. And as I say, in the end, all we can leave behind is gratitude, joy and love. Thank you very much.
So Phil liked stuff, and he liked old stuff, and so he was always on this lady's case in the museum and study collections. Welcome, Judy Wilcox.
Thank you. In a good way. He was on my case in a good way. Thanks. So hopefully our little slides will start to cycle through. Appropriately enough. So I arrived at Central St Martin's in 2008, and I'm not from the art school world. I'm a traditional museum professional, schooled in real museums, and I was quite terrified when I first arrived at Central St Martin's, but I put my big girl pants on and I got myself out to a private view to see if I could meet some of my colleagues, and one of the first people that I met was Phil. And it was a confusing exhibition. I didn't really understand what was going on. There was some quite dense performance, and I was panicking a bit, but I discovered Phil propping up the bar, making wry, dare I say, disrespectful comments about what was going on and having a quiet little swear over his glass of wine. So we very quickly bonded over all sorts of things, our northernness, our tendency for plain speaking, our shared love of material culture, a desire to honour the past and what's gone before, and a bit of a wicked sense of humour. And I believe my predecessor in the museum was a bit of a gatekeeper. She wasn't keen on the idea of people coming to have a rummage in the collections, but it wasn't long before Phil got on my case and wangled his way in to spend a day in the stores. And now I know a little bit about books. I knew a little bit about books then, and I loved books. And I knew that we had this incredible collection of incunabula and early rare printed books. But I couldn't really articulate why they were so amazing, not in detail, not beyond a sort of superficial understanding. And it was Phil who taught me how to understand that world. And he was generous and he was painstaking and he was patient. And thus began my education. And it was Phil who taught me why an escalated indent published by the Aldine Press in the 1490s is a thing of beauty, or the crisp lines of an early printed Baskerville. That timing's really good. They just popped up right in the right moment there. And that continued when we started to take objects up to the classroom. And I learned an incredible amount there because I sat alongside the students ostensibly to look after the museum objects, but really I was doing my BA too. And Phil, of course, had his favourites among the objects. There were things that would come out time and time again, including those amazing, huge books of church music, which I now understand married both parts of his world, the ecclesiastical and the design. So all of that work together led in 2014 to the first show that we did together, Lettering Objects Examples Practice. And I think everybody in the museum team would say that is hands down the exhibition that we have enjoyed working on the most, because Phil was fun and because he was generous and because he never made anybody feel their ignorance, and he shared his knowledge with so much joy and so much enthusiasm. But can we just talk about timeliness and lateness in Phil's delivery of the things that he made and the things that he did? And I understand why that was so. It wasn't lethargy. It was because he was always running too many projects at once, and that brain of his was always going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. But when he'd been our designer for other museum projects, when we'd been a client, it was painful how last minute Phil would be. And often the files arrived just as the deadline had passed. And often we were putting exhibition panel texts and labels up on the morning of the show or as the show was opening. And one might assume that for Phil's own show, it would be different. But it wasn't. It was the same old. Last day, labels going up on the day of the show, wandering around with a junior hacksaw and some blue tack and hoping for the best. But what a pleasure, what an absolute pleasure that show was. So there we were thinking about the history of design, of lettering, of the printed page, and how that plays out in contemporary practice. And that was wonderful. But what was really wonderful was to get to work on Extol, which opened last autumn. And we got to think about those things again, but we also got to think about and celebrate the mad magpie that was Phil Baines, the insane amount of stuff that fed his artistic and creative brain, and how that material culture really underpinned everything that he did and everything that he was. It wasn't as easy or as pleasurable an experience as the previous exhibition had been, because things were getting difficult very quickly. And it was becoming more and more tricky to download all of that amazing intelligence from Phil's brain. But we got there in the end. And what an incredible night that was when the exhibition opened, and what a massive privilege it was to be there and bear witness to all of the love and respect and the quiet joy that was in that room, to be able to take that moment to celebrate Phil, and how amazing that he was there to see it and to be able to soak all of that up. So I would describe Phil as an old school academic. He came through the academy at a time when there was more time. And God knows Phil manufactured time. I don't know how he did it, but he thought deeply and hard. He practiced his practice. He researched. He gathered together this really extraordinary body of knowledge and skill. Excuse me. And he shared that with all of us so generously. He really, really gave of his time and his knowledge and his understanding, both to colleagues and the students that he taught. And the week that he passed away, I was putting on another small show in the Lethaby Gallery that was the result of a collaboration with MA Art and Science students who'd come to me saying that they were exploring the technology of storytelling. So we did a project that was around lettering and print and the printed page. And we were putting things in cases in the Lethaby Gallery that were pure 100% Phil. I would never have been able to run that project if he hadn't taught me all the things that he taught me and shared all the knowledge and intelligence that he had. And although none of us are ever going to be able to replicate who he was or what he knew, I feel like if Phil was a stone thrown into the lake of life, that we're all these ripples, and each of us is just a ripple going out and sharing some of that practice and sharing some of the amazingness that was Phil. And if that's all we can do is to do our best as individuals to carry a little bit of that flame, then hopefully some of the amazingness that was Phil will continue to live on. So I want to end this short tribute with the way we always ended our emails to each other. Thanks. It was a pleasure doing business with you.
So we've had how Phil taught his colleagues, but now the lowdown from some students. So it's a great pleasure to welcome two alumni, Kate Goodridge, as was, and Alessia Mazzarella, who are going to talk about typography special interest.
Catherine has kindly asked us, as she's just said, to share some words about our experience being taught by Phil and being part of his typography special interest group with T-shirt from 2010 to 2012. Please excuse the images that accompany this. We are typographers, not photographers. Some are ours and others are borrowed.
Phil was so deeply intertwined with CSM graphics for many years. We weren't actually taught by him in first year, hearing about him from afar, building a mythical sense of this looming figure clad in cycling lycra.
We then met him personally in second year with a sense of reverence and quickly realised that whilst a tomb of knowledge, he was not someone that deigned to just sprinkle his students with nuggets of his wisdom. You got the feeling that for Phil, this was more than a job. He had a drive to share and a desire to spark curiosity.
As a tutor, he had a roundabout way of giving feedback that could have been interpreted in many ways. You could choose what you wanted to hear, water off, a duck's back to some, but provided clear, concise insight if you knew what you were listening for. Praise, whilst given scantily, was treasured dearly.
For us, Phil created the magic in the course, generously filling the gaps left by bureaucracy with his own time and effort. The majority of what we got from Phil was often on his own time, which was a precious and rare thing.
Business lectures, replete with Santa costumes, public lettering walks, bus tours, studio field trips, and of course, the typography special interest group.
Phil ran TSI for 7 years, starting in 2009. We think it was 7 years, we're not quite sure. Each year, he drew together an eclectic bunch of second and third years with a common interest in the nerdiest part of what is arguably quite a cool degree, quickly becoming a tight community within the club and somewhat an amusing mystery to outsiders, all completely optional and absolutely our favourite part of the course.
Wednesday afternoon deep dives into the central lettering record, and of course, Phil's own brain. The smell of old Manila, making our own stencil typefaces by hand, learning how to space and form letters slowly with our hands when speed and computers are increasingly king.
He gave up his Easter breaks to drag ragtag groups of 20-something-year-olds around various European cities to look at letters and drink with us in the evenings in good measure, perhaps losing a passport along the way. His incredible spontaneity of being able to find a learning experience absolutely anywhere at any time.
In the summers, he generously opened his family home to his TSI and tutor groups for barbecues to celebrate the year past. A sentiment that summarizes our experience with Phil in his own words from our visit to Willesden Green in our third year.
I see people in a different way to the rest of the course. Actually, for a lot of you, I don't really know your work that well. I just know you as people. And that's really nice. That's a luxury that I have that a lot of the other tutors don't have. And I really like that.
More than anything, Phil taught us how to look. We are indebted to him for making us the designers we are today, overseeing our student years with a sparkle in his eye while he watched us figure it out. Thank you, Phil.
I'm leaving that one up because embedded in the stencils, it says, "We love you, Phil," on the left-hand side. So the next students aren't here, and that's true of many of our alumni on the course, is that they're spread globally. And so I wanted to have that represented and to have voices of students who I knew couldn't be here in person, but I also knew how much Phil meant to them. And so the next three students are going to share via a little film that they've made, Book Talk, something that that they worked with Phil on called Book Talk. So Hien Ho Cho, Natalie Braun and Ying Tong Tan.
We regret not being able to join all of you physically, but are very thankful and honored to share some fond memories we had with Phil. We'd rather talk through images, so here we go. Phil in his collection room. I liked exploring his room. Phil always has something in this room that I could get inspired from. Phil often asked us to help out through school stuff, and he liked to wear many different nice cycling suits. There are some funny photos of him. He was wearing purple clothes and he matched the section color in CSM. There are photos of him taking photos. We are like a gang. It was like a friend. When we went to the Netherlands for a TSI trip in 2013, we stayed together and it was hilarious. Like this.
A few of us had this thing we call Book Talk, a small casual book sharing session that started when we were in the third year, students at CSM. One day, Phil walked past one of our meetings somewhere in the graphic studio. He at first started out by lending us some books from his collection, but quickly started making guest appearances by popping in and out some sessions. After graduating, we started meeting up in cafes and galleries. Books and typography were always a subject, but it was about coming together, having some food and having a laugh. One of our best sessions was in his living room, with a whole lot of books he selected, including some that were designed by him. Remember him whipping up cream in the kitchen for the scones we bought. It was a memorable afternoon. Some of us then left London and moved back to our respective countries. But whenever we visited London again, we would catch up and, of course, do a book talk with whoever was around.
Phil did a trip to South Korea in 2015, and who is based in South Korea, and I was happy to also fly over to welcome Phil to Asia. We became students again, listening to him, looking at his notebook doodles, and these are all his name in Hangul characters that he sketched. We tagged along to visit some sculptures and sites and places that he was pretty excited about. Some was at the Olympic Park and so. He met up with lots of students for dinner and drinks. Many of us were CSM or CSM alumni who were in Korea. Photos of us having a good time. We also managed to somehow squeeze in a book talk session at the airport before his flight back. This also happened to be our 22nd and last book talk session.
Thank you, Phil, for always being so generous, warm, supportive, charming, mischievous, insightful, for taking time to talk and answer any questions we had, always concise and deliberate with his words.
We miss having a nightcap with him, seeing him walk to his office in his bright cycling wear, with his cheeky smile and seeing him hop onto his bike after our book talk sessions.
Thank you, Phil, for always being there and making up many of our favorite memories.
So the next cluster of speakers made the transition from students to design assistants to friends. And first up is the designer and writer Christopher Wilson.
Thanks. Can you hear me? Independent graphic design is a contradiction in terms. You're usually employed by someone else and the design is made for someone else to use. Design is ultimately a service industry, and Phil was one of the very few people I've known who managed to achieve some autonomy within this. He did it partly by staying small. He worked alone or with one assistant at a time. The medium of letterpress was important to him because I could do all of the work myself. Layout, setting, printing. His bicycle was another piece of technology that he could understand, maintain, and power alone. We worked in a studio that Phil had built in his back garden. This is it as photographed by me in August 2001. And this also manifested his independence. It was his design, built to his needs. Many of his projects were one-offs, free from the baggage of corporate identities that would have to be applied. The client was often a curator or an artist. The professional design world, with its open plan studios and people who think that the word creative is a noun, lived on some other planet. Jackie once told me of how a former student visited their house and was dismayed to find the great Phil Baines engaged in so lowly a task as fixing the garden fence. Such people missed the point. Phil observed no dismal work-life balance. You might be on holiday abroad, but you still photograph signs every day. The garden fence is work and craft and life, just as a book design is work and craft and life. In 1992, Phil co-curated an exhibition of work by Central School, St Martin's and CSM alumni. In its catalogue, David Ellis, who graduated a year before Phil, wrote, "What do you mean typography at St Martin's? There was no typography there in 1984, unless you mean that line we were taught to put at the bottom of our posters under the idea." In Phil's hands, the words communicate something, but the arrangement might communicate several other things. Often syntax is questioned. Stone utters if read from left to right, or one stutters if read in order of emphasis. In extreme cases, he would divide the text area into different invisible zones, each carrying its own characteristics. He would then pour the text through this framework, and if a certain word or letter fell into a certain zone, it would take on that zone's traits. If typography at St Martin's was the line we were taught to put under the idea, then Phil's incessantly varied, surprising, totally configured works were all the more incredible. The poster for his FF Can You typeface defines nature as all that through its own force develops, forms and moves. The quotation is uncredited, but comes from the great artist Kurt Schwitters, whose last years were spent in Ambleside, about 10 miles from where Phil grew up. Phil's grandfather was, briefly, Schwitters' GP. The quote summarizes Phil's approach to language. Words, clauses, sentences, paragraphs often go their own way. For Phil, one of the worst things that a designer could be was neat-minded, a superb insult. His own work is controlled, but it is never neat for the sake of being so. Phil described himself as being pedantic, and he was. But crucially, he was aware of his pedantry, so he could question it and thereby avoid becoming staid. On the first book I designed with him, I was presumptuous enough to turn up with some drawings of how I thought the cover should look. Phil might well have said, "Look, this is my job, my client, don't be so bold." Instead, he took the drawings seriously and, for better or worse, they became the cover. I never asked how he went about choosing former students to work with him. None of us were like each other. Phil can't be accused of picking the ones who'd be easy to work with. Maybe he just chose people whom he thought were bright, or who he thought might bring something new to the mix. But here one memory leaps out. Once we were discussing Jan Chickel's famous turn away from the asymmetric, active typography of his early career. Phil said something about there being no accounting for a young man's zeal. He was talking about Chickhold, but you can be sure that he was also talking about his own experience. Maybe zeal was the common factor among his assistants. In the late 90s, sorry, I'm folding this up so I'm not looking through it. In the late 90s, Phil wrote a reference letter for me. It said that my attitude as a CSM student had been interpreted by students and some staff as arrogance, but I think conviction is a better term. He added that I don't suffer fools gladly. This is supposed to get me a fucking job. This also could easily have been Phil speaking about himself. His Artwords diaries reveal that, as a student, he'd also had to think a good deal about the thin line dividing conviction from arrogance. Phil embodied some contradictions like anyone. He might recommend using only typefaces from the preceding 25 years, but he simultaneously rejected the US designer Jeff Keady's assertion that one cannot make a new design using an old face. This is another advantage of working alone. You're free to change your mind, or as Phil said in my interview with him for iMagazine, drop the ideology if it becomes a millstone. He personified a mix of reverence and impishness. On one bookshelf at the house stood the hardback True Resurrection and other imposing ecclesiastical volumes. On the shelf below these were Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols and, more pertinently, Hex Induction Hour by The Fall. If Phil had an ideology, it was forever oscillating between those two shelves.
Next up, David Pearson. I'm not going to introduce you, David. I'm just going to. Next up, David Pearson.
Thank you. I don't know what to apologise for the most, that hair or those jeans. When you judge the tone of this, can you just please bear in mind that whenever Phil greeted me, he would hug my partner Claire, and then he would kick me in the shins. And that really neatly sums up our relationship in so many ways. So in a college where students deeply cared about not appearing to care, I was lucky enough to find Catherine, who deeply cared, and Phil, who deeply didn't give a care what anyone thought of him. And you know, this was physically embodied in the way he chose to dress, which has come up several times, which also felt a bit like an act of aggression to me, especially when you were at close quarters with Phil. I mean, those Dayglow colours were, I guess, designed to be whizzing by you outside rather than being thrust upon your face all of the time. But one of the things that was perhaps even more grotesque was when you happen to see Phil in a suit, because by contrast, because you'd only seen him in these figure-hugging clothes the whole time, he suddenly took on a sort of David Byrne-like kind of quality when you saw him in a suit. The proportions and colours just seemed wildly wrong. I'm really kicking him, aren't I? Right, back to the plan. It's difficult to communicate how excited I was when Phil invited me to assist him on a design project for Phaidon in my second year. But I remember when I left his office, I let out an audible squeal of excitement, which I know I've never done before or since, but I just knew how big a moment it was for me. And I never fully made a lot of sense of this place, but Phil definitely made it seem a lot more normal somehow. And he crucially sort of gave me the room and the time, and he was very patient with me to let me grow in my own way. You know, book design felt like a good fit through Phil. And although I don't subscribe to all of his lessons, I still don't understand why you can't use a Battenberg page layout where it's image, type. We generally got on. There's some murmurings in the crowd. Phil was also northern, which was good. He liked to drink, good. He liked to eat more than one pie at a time, which was right on my alley street. But he was incredibly cheeky, of course, as many people have mentioned, and really the real lessons came from, sorry, I've just missed a bit. I realised quite quickly that engaging in an earnest chat with Phil, it wouldn't really go anywhere, but like by being cheeky and drinking, you could kind of learn so much through the kind of wearying and withering comments and the sarky kind of way you would kind of take people down and things down. You learn so much more that way. So I soon kind of learned. But I think the real lessons for me, or the best lessons, came from the stuff that was around the work. For example, my very first day, I was told off by Phil for not horizontally aligning the words on the hot and cold tap, which was quite the tone setter when we were about to start working together. Putting plates stacked according to their height on the drying rack, anyone? Another way of that really set the tone. Everything was a teachable moment for Phil. And the extra special coffee spoon, which somehow measures differently to any other spoon of the same size. I once suggested that I was going to hide the special coffee spoon from Phil, and he made it very, very clear that this would not end well for me. So I didn't do that. Pairing bread slices as if it's an open book, so they fit perfectly back together again when you complete your sandwich. I mean, that was a game changer for me. That's a Phil's gift to you. And also that it's perfectly normal for a graphic designer concerned with colour reproduction to have Gillian Anderson's face repeated many times for a screen backdrop. Another lesson. That it's perfectly normal for the inside of your house to look like a train station. That it's perfectly normal for me to sleep with a freshly adopted and deeply psychotic cat who likes to slash at human flesh in the middle of the night. There's some sort of lesson. That the Fall are good, that they are very, very good. That was a good one. And Nick Cave, obviously. And the gardening is good, although that was Jackie's lesson. But you can't talk about Phil without talking about Jackie and Felicity and Beth and the warmth of the family that I stepped into. And I know, you know, I couldn't. My nickname amongst the family was Slipper Man, and it's because I used to wear slippers in their house. That's how comfortable I was allowed to be there. And I know it's something I found out at the funeral, that how much it meant to my mum, the way you looked after me. I really appreciate it, especially because I used to play football in your garden and destroy your alliums, which I can't apologise enough about. Which brings me on to the last couple of years. You know, one or two of us have visited Phil and Jackie to help with the odd domestic projects, such as weaving a fucking massive sign in and around an established and overgrown bush. But these have been some of my favourite times with Phil, and it's not least because I got to spend so much time with him, which is what I always wanted more of. But oh, sorry, I was hoping I would do this. And I don't think I've ever laughed so much with Phil, and I'm not daft. Like I know that that's as much down to his condition as anything, because he was quick to emotion. But it felt like we were all somehow in a lovely bubble of time, and we got to focus only on the things that really mattered. But just to finish, if anyone is in any doubt about Phil not being in control of his faculties towards the end, there's a picture on this slideshow of Phil looking at me, trying to paint a letter in his garden, and I was doing such a bad job of it. Poor sod must have been really struggling, like if the illness wasn't enough. And at one point, after I'd bodged up about 4 letters, I said, "Phil, I think I've got it. You have to really load up the brush and make one distinct stroke." And I just heard him very quietly say, one distinct stroke in the wrong place." Thank you very much. Cheers.
And finally, actually not finally, nearly finally, I haven't done that very well. Jeremy Tankard.
A special coffee spoon. I can relate to that one. I first met Phil on my third year at the old Central St Martin's School of Art building on Longacre. That was 1989, and exciting times. An early project he set was to produce a broadsheet on a given subject. He gave me the English Electric DP1, commonly known as the Deltic locomotive. The signs were there from the start. When putting together thoughts for this evening, I could think of loads of little things, seemingly insignificant things, unspoken ideas, observations, moments and comments, things that make no sense to others. And if I were to try and weave them together in a coherent way, I'd just fail miserably. Lately, I would visit him from time to time and we'd venture out on day trips. And it's these that I've been asked to talk a little bit more about. Time goes so quick. His 60th birthday is a good place to start. Suitably, the party took place nearby here at the parcel yard in King's Cross Station. And it was a little after this that I found out about his illness. I popped over to see him and we went on a walk. Up the lane, out of his house, up the lane, across the fields, round and back down to collect the key to the village church from the warden. Part of his routine was to walk each day. At that time, he could do about 2 hours maximum. Slow going, but determined. At the top of the lane, we paused to take in the view, and he told me about the illness and what was likely and expected to happen. He was quite matter of fact about it, but for me, it was incredibly hard and shocking to hear. The rest of the walk was a bit foggy. But Phil was keen to show me the church in the village, the Minster Church of the Holy Trinity, which is an architecturally significant Saxon church with over 1,000 years of history, and it's quite cold. I don't think that Phil's passion for the importance of history in all things can be overestimated. There's a rightness to community and to the part that we each play in the lives of others. Of course, he got involved in local life and learnt bell ringing there, which he continued with until he was no longer able to do so. Out from under your feet, Jackie, and not causing trouble. Some time later, I took him to Cambridge Museum of Technology, which is housed in the city's former Victorian pumping station, which he was delighted at. Hugely excited at the magnificent machinery in the engine hall, the buildings themselves and the lettering all over the place. There's even a chaotic print room stuffed full with type paraphernalia, messy like his studio. I'd managed to wangle full access to wander freely around the place and down into its depths. And it was a shame that Phil couldn't take full advantage of this, now as he had with the aid of a lecky pole. He couldn't negotiate the stairs, so he loitered at the top, grinning inanely. After a long time and much effort in proving to bureaucrats that he was in fact ill, Phil was finally awarded a disabled parking badge. In celebration of this, we made full use of it, parking in the centre of Cambridge when we visited the Will Carter exhibition at one of the college libraries. By this time, his illness had progressed further. Gone were the lecky poles, and he now accessorised himself with a powered go-kart in stylish beige trim. I remember being told years ago, I thought it was 1 week, but Neville said it's 2 weeks, crash course for learning to drive with the police. I think this training shone through as he managed to manoeuvre the go-kart with the dexterity of a police chase. On a visit to the American cemetery just outside Cambridge, he was able to let rip down the side of the Great Wall at lightning speed. It's amazing how fast this thing could go. I did try and get a film of him in action, but by the time I'd finished fiddling with the phone, he was gone. We all take so much for granted. We just accept that our mentors will always be there to bounce ideas off. Over Christmas, I decided to try and visit more regularly. So in the new year, I arranged to pop over in the hope that there would still be some of Jackie's much lauded Christmas cake left. There was, served with Stilton, perfect. On this visit, which unbeknown to me then, would be the last time I'd see him. The Ds had progressed a huge amount. Mobility was reduced to near zero, and it was far more difficult for him to speak. We arranged that I'd come over for the day on March the 16th, as Jackie was due out on a surprise trip. Anyway, I left around 5 p.m. It was dark. I had to negotiate reversing out of the drive, which is a hair-raising experience in the daylight. I left him in his chair, happy, not a care in the world. He died 2 days later. I never in my wildest dreams thought that when I first met Phil back in 1989, I would know him for so long and with such deep respect and honest admiration. I loved his intense commitment and attention to detail, offset with the cheek of a child and the glint in the eye. I think that the lasting posthumous lesson I got from him is that life is good. It should be deeply cherished, and you should do what you want, because life can also be shit.
So we are finally, and following contributions from all sorts of different walks of life, practitioners, colleagues, former students, friends, it's really lovely to welcome Jackie Baines, Phil's wife, who's going to share some of Phil's own thoughts on what it is, or what it was, to be a St Martin's student. If she can.
How do I follow that? Can you hear me? Sorry, a bit wobbly. Firstly, thank you all for coming. It means a huge amount to me and our girls and the rest of his family who are all here, including his dad. It's so fitting that we are able to celebrate Phil at his beloved St Martin's, where he was a student and where he taught for almost 30 years. This place meant so much to him. Perhaps this might demonstrate how much. Some of you may know, perhaps all of you may know now, that Phil and I met here at St Martin's, albeit the Long Acre building, back in 1982. We're both on the graphics course, good friends from the start. I was 18, he was 23. We lived at Ralph West, Hall of Residence with Andy and Mike. And our 42-year journey had begun. Whilst preparing material for Phil's recent exhibition, we came across his pre-St Martin's diaries. You won't be surprised to learn that he recorded every brief and outcome of each project he was given whilst on foundation at Carlisle. But among the pages, I came across two particular entries that struck me how much St Martin's had meant to him from the start. This is a transcript from his diary from 1982. February 25th, St Martin's School of Art visit. He starts by quoting a recent article by P. Morley in the NME. I forced myself to be brief, bold, secret, but coherent, joyous and unexpectedly apprehensive, just like an altered images song, which trembles and then tumbles somewhere between knowing the facts of life and discovering one of the meanings of life. He went on to say, St Martin's approach to graphics would suit me down to the ground. I was just so impressed. It's going to be my first choice. I could be happy. As some of you of the right age will get that. May the 11th, first choice, BA interview, St Martin's and the aftermath. Where shall I begin? To be brief, I was far too nervous. I think I've blown it. I suspect I came across as not being dedicated, professional and determined enough, and a bit airy-fairy. To be long-winded, I went in, I placed my folder on the table. One of the first questions they asked me was how I saw myself in 3 years. I really fumbled this one. Something about not being sure of a direction at present, etc., etc. It was really bad. Fortunately, they asked me this again later, and I was able to mention something about Saville and Garrett and publishing record companies. But I was glad they asked me again, but it did throw me. It's hard to know what they thought of my work. They liked my train slides and were interested to know how I'd learnt my architectural drawing skills. But otherwise, they played everything very close to their chest. To be depressed was the order of events after the interview. I came out afterwards looking as if they'd eaten me alive. I wasn't much fun returning home on the train. The next few days, he records how he spent most of his time playing rounders or in the Twisted Wheel, their local pub, going to parties, drinking lots of wine, eating communal bowls of Rice Krispies and sleeping. May 14th. I arrived at Oxenholme, met a friend, Barbara. I was greeted with the question, well, how did your interview go? Not very well, really. I was really nervous. I don't think I've got in. Oh, don't say that, she says. I cycled home, opened the door, and stuck in the back of the letterbox was a brown envelope. It was fat. I couldn't really believe it. I didn't want to open it. I did want to open it. I brought my bike in, looked through my other mail, none from London. I looked at the brown envelope again. It looked as though it said St. Martin's School of Art. So trembling, I opened it. Open brackets. I should have been a writer. Oh, get on with it. Close brackets. There were too many bits of paper. Which one was which? I fumbled my way to the right one. Fucking hell, I'm in. I don't believe it. There was no one else in the house. I had to tell someone. Barbara, the only person around, I picked up my keys and ran out the door. I'm in. I'm in. Repeat until I believe it. Pinch yourself, just to make sure. I went home. I rang the Berries, family friends. I rang Rosemary. I proved myself. I'm in. I'm in. I'm in. I'm in. He repeated it about 16 times. I went upstairs. I was upstairs when Mum came home. I put on my serious voice. You know, I told you I didn't expect to get in. Yes, she said. I was wrong. I'm in. Big emotional scenes, jumping up and down, excitedly, like children, big hugs, etc. He finishes off this entry by writing, the rest could be history if I work hard. And I think we can agree that he did work hard and he did make history. Thank you all again for coming. It would have meant the world to him, and it really does mean the world to us. Please come and say hello afterwards. Thank you.
So just to wrap up, Phil's family would love for you to share your stories of Phil via sarkitype.com. We've all shared a lot of stories this evening, but yeah, Phil's family would love for you to share your stories. On the backs of your postcards is the details of sarkitype.com, but also the Much Love Giving site. One thing that Phil did a lot and was passionate about was raising money and awareness for ataxia and multiple system atrophy. And so the details of the Much Love site are on the QR code on the back of your postcards. It's Phil Baines, muchlove.com. And also one of best friends, Nathan Hurley, is his fundraising for multiple system atrophy trust by cycling from Cardiff to the Caspian Sea. So if you want to get behind him and sponsor him too, that would be absolutely amazing. Don't forget there are the books here to collect, and there is a book of condolence to sign. But for now, really the main job is to go to the bar and to raise a toast to Phil. Thank you.